Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey into the heart of ancient Rome, a place of marble gods and mortal men, where the line between power and perversion often blurred. Close your eyes for a moment. Can you feel the cool night air on your face? Imagine the scent of cypress trees and lamp oil, the distant murmur of a sleeping city. We're standing on the Palatine Hill high above the Forum, looking out over a city that believed itself eternal. Below us, in the vast, sprawling palace of the Emperor, a young man is about to make a decision so strange, so utterly shocking, that it will echo through history for centuries to come. You probably won't survive this, but we'll try to get through it together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, why not post your location and what time it is for you right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a roar, but with a whisper that grew into a rumour that became a scandal, and a scandal that would define the reign of one of Rome's most infamous emperors, Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus. You're familiar with the name, of course. We think of him as a madman, a tyrant, a fiddler, while Rome burned. But before all that, before the murder and the madness, he was just a young man, thrust into unimaginable power at the tender age of 17. Imagine that, a teenager with the keys to the world's most powerful empire. He was handsome, charismatic, and initially quite popular. The first few years of his reign were actually considered a golden age, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the prefect Burrus. But you see, the seeds of his downfall were already there, buried deep beneath the surface of his public persona, waiting for the right kind of water and the right kind of light to sprout into something monstrous. And that water and light came in the form of a man. A male slave, to be precise, named Doryphorus. You might be picturing a powerful, muscular figure, a gladiator perhaps, but that's not quite right. The name Doryphorus, which in Greek means spear-bearer, was a common one, and the man who held it was a freedman, a former slave who had earned his liberty. We don't have a lot of solid, verifiable details about Doryphorus's early life, which is a common problem with figures who weren't born into the Roman elite. They're like shadows in the historical record, only appearing when they cross paths with someone important. But what we do know is that he was a beautiful man, possessing a striking physical presence that immediately caught Nero's eye. Now, it's important to understand the context here. Roman society was quite different from our own. While same-sex relationships weren't necessarily celebrated in the same way we might think of them today, they were a part of the social fabric, especially between a master and a slave or a freedman. The power dynamics were key. A Roman man could engage in sexual relationships with men without it reflecting poorly on his masculinity, as long as he was the dominant partner. It was about power and control, not about a label or an identity. But Nero, as you'll see, was never one for subtlety or convention. His fascination with Doryphorus went far beyond a typical master-freedman dynamic. It was an obsession, a fixation that bordered on madness. It was a relationship that began in the private gilded rooms of the palace, away from the prying eyes of the Senate and the Roman people. At first, it was just another one of Nero's many dalliances. He had a reputation for a certain kind of bohemian, artistic sensibility. He loved music, poetry, and theatre, and he was always surrounded by a court of sycophants and hangers-on who encouraged his every whim. Doryphorus became his muse, his confidant, his constant companion. He was always there, a steady presence in the whirlwind of Nero's life. Historians still argue whether Nero's feelings for Doryphorus were a genuine deep love, or simply another manifestation of his insatiable desire for power and control. Was it an authentic connection between two people? Or was Doryphorus just another prop in the emperor's grand theatrical performance? We can't know for sure, of course. We only have the words of ancient writers like Suetonius and Tacitus, who were often biased and writing long after the fact, with their own agendas to push. But their accounts paint a vivid picture of a relationship that was anything but typical. You see, Nero was a man who craved to be different. He was bored with the staid traditions of the Roman elite. He wanted to shock, to impress, to break the rules. And in Doryphorus, he found a perfect vehicle for his rebellion. Their relationship became more than just an affair. It became a public spectacle, a defiance of Roman norms that was so brazen it was almost unthinkable. This was a mainstream historical fact. Roman emperors often used their personal lives to project a certain image of themselves, but Nero was doing the opposite. He was using his personal life to deliberately subvert that image. Think of it this way. The emperor was supposed to be the father of the nation, the embodiment of Roman virtue and masculine strength. He was a symbol of order and tradition. But Nero was a rebellious teenager with a god complex, and he saw all those traditions as a cage. And so he began to dismantle that cage piece by piece, starting with his own personal life. The quirkier, fringe tidbit here is that Doryphorus wasn't the only man Nero was fascinated with. The emperor was also obsessed with a young man named Sporus, whom he would later, in a truly bizarre act, emasculate and then marry. But Doryphorus was the first, the one who set the stage for all the madness that was to follow. He was Nero's first great love, or at least the first one he decided to turn into a public performance. Imagine the dinner parties in the palace. The senators and their wives gathered around a table piled high with exotic delicacies, and Nero and Doryphorus entering the room, not as master and freedman, but as equals. The whispers would have been deafening, even in the cavernous halls of the Golden House. They would have seen the way Nero looked at Doryphorus, not with the cold, detached gaze of a master, but with a gaze filled with a strange, almost childlike adoration. They would have seen the subtle, intimate gestures, the way Nero might touch his arm or whisper a secret into his ear. And they would have been horrified. This wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. It was a sign that the emperor's mind was not on the affairs of the state, but on the affairs of his heart, and that heart seemed to be leading him down a very strange and perilous path. And you, listening here in the quiet of your room, can almost feel the tension in that air, the palpable sense of unease that hung over the Roman elite as they watched their emperor slowly, deliberately unravel right before their eyes. As you continue your imagined journey through the palace, you realize that Nero's court wasn't just a place of power, it was a stage. Every gesture, every glance, every whispered aside was part of a grand performance. And in this particular act, the theme was opulence and transgression. The so-called Golden Age of Nero's early reign was for his inner circle a period of unparalleled debauchery. The moral compass of the Roman elite had always been a bit shaky, let's say, but Nero took it to a whole new level. He didn't just bend the rules, he snapped them in half with a theatrical flourish and then threw the pieces in the air like confetti. Imagine the dinner parties. Not the sedate formal affairs of the old guard, but wild, multi-day feasts that stretched from sunset to sunrise. The air would be thick with the scent of roasted peacock and exotic spices, the sound of lyres and flutes filling the room, and the laughter. Oh, the laughter was a little too loud, a little too close to hysteria. Nero, with Doryphorus often by his side, would be the centre of it all. He wasn't just the emperor, he was the master of ceremonies, the lead actor, the star. His court was a mix of senators who held their tongues and their wine cups equally tight, poets who wrote fawning verses about his genius, and a swarm of young men and women who were there for one simple reason: to please the emperor and get a piece of his immense wealth and power. This was a time when the traditional Roman virtues of gravitas, dignity, pietas, duty, and virtues, manly courage, were being tossed aside like yesterday's bread. Nero was a fan of Greek culture, particularly its more libertine aspects. He saw himself as an artist, a philosopher king in the Hellenistic mould, not a stern Roman statesman in the style of Augustus. A mainstream historical fact is that this Greek obsession was a major point of contention between Nero and the more conservative elements of the Senate. They saw his passion for music, poetry, and chariot racing as unbecoming of an emperor. To them, the leader of Rome should be leading armies, not singing on a stage. But for Nero and his circle, this was liberation. He created a world where artifice and performance were valued above all else, and in this world his desires were not just tolerated, they were actively encouraged. The sycophants who surrounded him knew that the quickest way to Nero's good graces was to praise his singing voice, his poetry, or his latest scandalous affair. They created a bubble around him, a reality distortion field where his every whim was genius, and his every transgression was a bold artistic statement. Doryphorus existed within this bubble, not as a subject, but as a privileged insider. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Nero was a big fan of a particular kind of perfume made from crushed flowers and exotic spices. He would often have this scent pumped through the palace's water fountains and air vents so that the entire golden house smelled like a garden of earthly delights. Can you imagine walking into a meeting with the emperor and being hit with this overwhelming floral aroma? It was all part of the sensory overload, the deliberate blurring of reality and fantasy that defined Nero's court. You see, the relationship between Nero and Doryphorus was a product of this environment. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger cultural shift. Nero was creating a new kind of Roman elite, one based on personal loyalty and shared pleasures, not on old family names and political alliances. He was building his own power base, and Doryphorus was a key part of it. He was more than just a companion. He was a symbol of Nero's defiance, a living, breathing rejection of everything the old Roman world held dear. Historians still argue whether Nero's increasingly erratic behaviour was the result of a genuine mental illness, or if it was a calculated political strategy to consolidate power and dismantle the old guard. Was he truly mad, or was he a genius manipulator playing a long, dangerous game? We can't know for sure, of course. But what we can see is the effect it had on his court. The paranoia began to creep in. People were always watching, always whispering, always trying to figure out who was in favour and who was on the outs. Doryphorus, as Nero's constant companion, was a lightning rod for this tension. He was loved by Nero and hated by everyone who saw him as an upstart, a symbol of the emperor's declining sanity. Think about the atmosphere. Every morning you would wake up wondering if you were still in the emperor's good graces. Every night you would go to bed wondering if you would wake up at all. The palace was a beautiful cage, and the emperor's erratic moods were the unpredictable bars. For the most part, Nero was benevolent and generous, but you always knew that a single misstep, a single perceived slight, could lead to a one-way trip to the executioner's block. And the people who suffered most from these moods were often those who were closest to him. His wife, Octavia, was a victim of this. She was a quiet, traditional Roman woman who represented everything Nero was trying to escape. Her piety and modesty were a constant source of irritation to him, a reminder of the life he refused to live. Her tragic fate, her exile, and eventual murder on Nero's orders is a grim callback to the instability of this world. Nero was building his own world, his own rules, and anyone who didn't fit into it was simply removed. So, as you walk through the imagined palace halls, remember that this was not just a place of parties and poetry. It was a place of intrigue, ambition, and quiet terror. You see the tapestries on the wall depicting scenes from Greek myths, and you think of the emperor's love for art. You see the gilded statues of Roman gods, and you remember the pious prayers of the old families. But in the shadows, you also see the nervous glances of the courtiers, the tight smiles of the senators, and the quiet, almost invisible figure of Doryphorus, standing just a little too close to the source of all that power. He was a freedman who had risen to the very top, not through military might or political cunning, but through a strange, intense affection from the one man who controlled everything. And for better or for worse, his fate was now inextricably linked with the fate of the Roman Empire itself. The golden age of debauchery was well and truly underway, and it was about to get a whole lot stranger. Let's shift our focus now, away from the glittering, chaotic world of the court, and zoom in on the man at the centre of Nero's obsession, Doryphorus. You've heard his name, but who was he really? We know he was a freedman, a former slave, which tells us a great deal about his journey. To be a slave in ancient Rome was to be a piece of property. You had no rights, no identity of your own. Your life was dictated by the whims of your owner. But to become a freedman was to be reborn. It meant you had been granted your liberty, either through purchase, by your master's will, or for exceptional service. It was a step up, a chance to carve out a life for yourself in a world that had once owned you. Doryphorus's rise from this status to a position of immense influence within the imperial household is a testament to his intelligence, his charm, or perhaps simply his incredible luck. A mainstream historical fact about freedmen is that they often maintained a close relationship with their former master, who became their patron. This relationship was based on mutual obligations. The freedman might still work for the patron, and in return the patron would offer protection and support. In Doryphorus's case, this patron-client relationship was taken to a bizarre and unprecedented extreme. He wasn't just a loyal freedman, he was Nero's confidant, his lover, his partner in crime. The power dynamic, remember, was what defined these relationships in the Roman world. But what we're seeing here is a strange reversal, a blurring of lines that would have shocked even the most jaded of Roman senators. We don't have a photograph of Doryphorus, of course, but the ancient sources describe him as a man of great physical beauty. Suetonius, the biographer, mentions his delicate features and youthful appearance. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. In Roman society, a man's facial hair was a huge deal. Beards were seen as a sign of maturity and wisdom, and a clean-shaven face was considered youthful. The fact that Nero was obsessed with the delicate, clean-shaven Doryphorus suggests he was drawn to a more Hellenistic, youthful ideal of beauty, not the stern, bearded masculinity that Rome typically celebrated. This was a direct defiance of traditional Roman aesthetics, another subtle act of rebellion from the emperor. Doryphorus was also known for his intelligence and his wit. He was not just a pretty face, he was a smart man who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of the Roman court. He had likely spent years observing the powerful people around him, learning their secrets and their weaknesses. And now he was using that knowledge to his advantage. He had Nero's ear, and in a court where everything hinged on the emperor's favour, that was the most valuable commodity of all. He would have been a source of information, a filter for the emperor, and a gatekeeper for anyone who wanted an audience with Nero. Historians still argue whether Doryphorus wielded any real political power, or if he was simply a pawn in Nero's increasingly complex games. Was he an evil influence, whispering wicked ideas into the emperor's ear, or was he a calming presence, a stabilizing force in the chaotic world of Nero's mind? Again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a freedman who suddenly found himself with more power than most senators, and that would have been a heady, corrupting experience. It's likely that he used his influence to help his friends and hurt his enemies, just as any other powerful Roman would have done. But it's also likely that he genuinely cared for Nero, that he saw the vulnerable, artistic young man beneath the golden toga and the divine title. So you see him now, this ghost in the historical record. He's not a myth, not just a name. He's a man who, by a twist of fate, found himself in a position that no one could have ever predicted. He was a survivor, a man who had risen from nothing to a place of immense privilege, and his relationship with Nero was a strange, complicated dance of power, affection, and mutual need. Nero needed a confidant, someone who saw him as more than just an emperor, and Doryphorus needed a patron, someone who could protect him and his newfound status from the jealous, angry eyes of the Roman elite. The stage was set. Nero had his muse, his confidant, his partner in defiance, and the Roman court was watching, their collective breath held in a mixture of fascination and horror. They had seen powerful men take male lovers before, but this was different. This was not a quick fling or a private affair. This was a public spectacle, a deliberate provocation. Nero was not just having a relationship, he was performing one. He was forcing the Roman world to acknowledge his desires, to accept them, to even celebrate them. And that, more than anything else, was what scared them. Because if the emperor could defy the laws of social convention, what other laws might he decide were no longer worth following? Imagine you are a senator, a man of old wealth and ancient lineage. You've spent your entire life believing in the Roman way, the traditions, the social hierarchy, and then you see your emperor, the divine Augustus, the leader of the known world, acting like this. You'd be horrified, of course. You'd see it as a sign of the end times, a sign that the gods had abandoned Rome and left it to the whims of a madman. And you'd be right to be worried. Because as we'll see, Nero's obsession with Doryphorus was just the first step on a long dark road. It was the crack in the facade, the first sign of the madness that would eventually consume not just the emperor, but the entire Roman Empire. This wasn't just a love story. It was a power struggle, a clash of cultures, and a harbinger of the chaos to come. Doryphorus was an outsider who had been brought into the inner circle, and in doing so he had upset a delicate balance of power that had been in place for centuries. The Roman elite, with their ancient names and their vast estates, would not stand for it. They would whisper, they would plot, and they would wait for the right moment to strike. And in the meantime they would watch, horrified and fascinated, as the emperor continued his strange and dangerous performance. The golden age of debauchery was about to reach its peak, and the main event was just around the corner. A wedding a wedding that would defy all norms and change everything. Now that we've set the stage and introduced our key players, let's pull back the curtain on the central relationship itself. The connection between Nero and Doryphorus was, at its core, a direct and brazen challenge to the very foundation of Roman masculinity. You're watching an emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, deliberately subverting the expectations of his office. He wasn't just having a lover, he was crafting a public role for Doryphorus that was previously unheard of for a freedman, or indeed for any man in Rome. A mainstream historical fact is that Roman society had a strict code of behaviour for same-sex relationships. It was generally accepted for a man to be the dominant or active partner, especially with slaves or younger men. The submissive or passive role was seen as a grave weakness, something that brought dishonour upon a man and his family. The fact that Nero was willing to not just be seen as the passive partner, but to actively embrace and perform this role was utterly shocking. It was a rejection of everything that a Roman emperor was supposed to be. To the senators and the old Roman families, this was more than just a scandal. It was a sign of the world turning upside down. It was proof that their emperor was not just morally corrupt, but that he was fundamentally unfit to rule. The early days of their relationship, while likely private, would have been filled with an almost childish glee on Nero's part. He was a man who loved to play act, to be someone else. He had a passion for the theatre, for music, for putting on a show. And in his relationship with Doryphorus, he found the ultimate stage. He wasn't just being a patron to a freedman. He was performing a new kind of role for himself. And he was doing it with a sense of entitlement and a lack of shame that was simply breathtaking to the Romans of the time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Nero was obsessed with the Greek myth of the goddess Cybele and her eunuch priests, who would castrate themselves as a sign of devotion. Nero, with his fascination for all things theatrical and his rebellious nature, may have seen this as the ultimate act of gender subversion. While he didn't go that far with Doryphorus, his later actions with another boy, Sporus, were a grim echo of this kind of theatrical, mythological roleplay. He was constantly looking for new ways to shock and to defy, and the mythology of the ancient world provided him with a perfect script. Historians still argue whether Nero's bizarre behaviour was driven by genuine sexual identity issues, or if it was a purely political act designed to dismantle the old guard and assert his own new, modern vision for Rome. Was he a man truly wrestling with his own sense of self, or was he a master manipulator using shock and spectacle to consolidate his power? The sources, like Suetonius and Tacitus, often portray him as a villain and a monster, but it's important to remember that they were writing from a specific perspective, one that was often hostile to Nero's memory. The truth, as always, is probably far more nuanced. But regardless of his motives, the effect was the same. The relationship between Nero and Doryphorus became a public spectacle. The ancient sources tell us that Nero would often have Doryphorus by his side in public, and that he would shower him with gifts and titles that were wildly inappropriate for a freedman. This wasn't a secret affair. It was a defiant statement. Nero was essentially telling the Roman world, "This is my partner, and you will respect him as such." And the Roman world, with its rigid social hierarchy and its fear of anything that upset the established order, was completely unprepared for it. Imagine the discomfort. You're a high-ranking senator, a man whose family has served Rome for generations. You're invited to a banquet at the palace, and you have to sit there, forced to watch as the emperor lavishes attention on a former slave who now has more influence than you do. You'd be filled with a quiet, burning resentment. You'd feel a sense of outrage that was both personal and political. This was a direct insult to your station, a blatant disregard for the social contract that had held Rome together for centuries. This was the genius and the madness of Nero. He was a master of psychological warfare. He knew that by challenging the social order in such a public and personal way, he was not just shocking the Roman elite, he was undermining their authority. He was proving that the old rules no longer applied. He was showing them that the power of the emperor was absolute, that he could do whatever he wanted, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. Doryphorus, in all of this, was more than just a partner. He was a living symbol of Nero's power. He was a daily, visible reminder of the emperor's boundless and seemingly unhinged authority. And the fact that he was a former slave made it all the more potent. He was a walking, talking embodiment of Nero's belief that he could elevate anyone he chose to, and that the traditional hierarchies of Roman society were utterly meaningless. The stage was set for a confrontation. Not a battle with swords and shields, but a quiet, simmering conflict between the old guard and the new emperor. A conflict that would be fought not in the Senate, but in the private rooms and the public spectacles of the Roman court. The relationship between Nero and Doryphorus was the first shot in that war, and it was a shot that would soon lead to a much larger and far more shocking event. A wedding. A wedding that would completely blur the lines between gender, power, and performance, and leave the Roman world reeling. So as you listen to the gentle hum of your fan and the quiet of your room, try to imagine the sheer audacity of it all. A young emperor, barely out of his teens, challenging the entire social structure of the Roman world, with a former slave by his side. It was a love story, yes, but it was also a political statement, a declaration of war on tradition, and a harbinger of the madness to come. The play was just beginning, and the most dramatic acts were still to come. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the tension in the Roman court is at a fever pitch. But Nero, our young emperor, is completely oblivious to the quiet plotting and the simmering resentment. Or perhaps he isn't. Perhaps he just doesn't care. To him, the disapproval of the old guard is not a threat. It's a validation. It proves that he's a revolutionary, a visionary, a man ahead of his time, and what better way to celebrate this new, liberated vision for Rome than with a wedding? A wedding that would defy every social and religious norm and cement his place as a theatrical rule-breaking emperor. You're watching the preparations unfold. This isn't a small private affair. This is a public spectacle, a grand performance for all of Rome to see. The ancient sources are explicit on this point. They describe a ceremony that mirrored a traditional Roman wedding in every detail, except for one very significant difference. The groom was the emperor, and the bride was a man. A mainstream historical fact is that a traditional Roman wedding was a complex ritual-filled affair. It began with the couple signing a marriage contract, followed by a procession to the groom's house. The bride would wear a special tunic and a saffron-coloured veil, and her hair would be styled in a specific way. She would be led to her new home, where she would be carried over the threshold to symbolise her new life. All of these rituals, which were designed to reinforce the traditional gender roles in the social order, were about to be performed for a male couple. Imagine the sheer audacity of it. Nero, the emperor, the divinely appointed leader of Rome, would be taking on the role of the bride. You can almost see him now, preparing for the ceremony. He's not in a toga, the traditional dress of a Roman citizen. He's in a saffron-coloured veil, the flammeum that Roman brides wore. His hair is styled in the bridal fashion. He's not walking. He's being led, just like a Roman bride would be, to the place where the ceremony would be held. This was a deliberate, meticulously planned performance. It wasn't just a private act of love, it was a public act of defiance. He was forcing Rome to watch, to acknowledge, and to be complicit in his transgression. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Roman weddings often included a ritual where the groom would pretend to seize the bride from her mother, symbolising the violent origins of marriage in the myth of the rape of the Sabinas. Historians still argue whether this particular ritual was included in Nero's wedding to Doryphorus. It seems unlikely, given Nero's theatrical nature and his desire to play the bride, but it's a fascinating question. Would he have embraced the role so fully that he would have allowed Doryphorus to seize him? Or would he have found a way to subvert this tradition as well? Historians still argue whether this marriage was legally recognised by the Roman state. Roman law, of course, did not have a provision for same-sex marriage. So, was this a real marriage in the eyes of the law, or was it a purely symbolic theatrical act? The sources suggest it was the latter. It was a performance, a spectacle, a way for Nero to make a statement about his own power and his disregard for the old rules. But for Nero, it was a real marriage. He was not just playing a role, he was living a new reality of his own creation. And what about Doryphorus? He was now in an impossible position. He was a freedman who was being asked to play the role of a Roman husband to his former master, the emperor. It was a position of unimaginable power and privilege, but also one of immense danger. He was now a target, a symbol of Nero's madness. Every senator who was disgusted by the emperor's behaviour would now see Doryphorus as the source of the problem, the corrupting influence, the reason for Rome's moral decline. The wedding would have been attended by the cream of Roman society. Senators, Vestal virgins, and other members of the Roman elite would have been forced to witness this grotesque spectacle. Their attendance would have been a public declaration of loyalty to Nero, a tacit endorsement of his bizarre behaviour. You can imagine their faces, a mixture of horror, disgust, and forced smiles. They would have been thinking of their ancestors, the stern, virtuous men who had built the Roman Republic, and they would have been wondering what had happened to their great city. The ceremony itself would have been a strange mix of tradition and transgression. The traditional marriage vows would have been exchanged, but with a bizarre twist. The contract would have been signed, but with the full understanding that it was a legal absurdity. And at the end, the traditional confariatio bread would have been shared, a ritual that was meant to signify the unbreakable bond between a man and a woman, but was now being used to signify the bond between an emperor and his male freedman. For Nero, this was the ultimate triumph. He had not only defied the social norms of his time, he had made his enemies watch him do it. He had taken the most sacred of Roman institutions, the marriage ceremony, and turned it into a weapon against the very people who held it dear. He was a master of psychological warfare, and this was his masterpiece. But for Doryphorus, it was a moment of profound change. He was no longer just a freedman. He was the emperor's wife. His life, his identity, and his fate were now inextricably linked with the fate of Nero. And as we will soon see, the life of Nero's wife was a strange, dangerous, and ultimately tragic one. The wedding was just the beginning. The real performance was about to begin, and it would involve a shocking reversal of gender roles that would leave the Roman world reeling. The emperor was not just a husband, he was now a wife, and he was about to start acting the part. The marriage is over, the ink is dry, and the Roman elite have returned to their palaces, buzzing with a mixture of disgust and fascination. But for you, watching from the shadows, the real show is just beginning. Nero, our theatrical emperor, has taken on the role of a Roman wife, and he's not just playing the part, he's living it. This is a deliberate, meticulously planned subversion of every gender role and social norm that had governed Roman life for centuries. A mainstream historical fact is that a Roman wife had a very specific set of duties and responsibilities. Her domain was the home, the domus. She was responsible for managing the household, raising the children, and maintaining the family's reputation for virtue and piety. She was expected to be modest, demure, and subservient to her husband. She was, in short, the very embodiment of Roman traditionalism. And now Nero the emperor was performing these duties for his new husband, Doryphorus. Imagine the scenes that must have unfolded in the gilded halls of the palace. Nero, not in a toga, but in the long, flowing stola of a Roman matron. He's not giving orders to the Senate, but fussing over the household accounts. He's not commanding legions, but managing the domestic staff. This was an act of pure, unadulterated performance art. He was taking the most sacred and traditional of Roman roles and twisting it into a grotesque mockery. And he was doing it with a sense of childlike glee, as if he were the first person to ever discover that you could break the rules just for the fun of it. The ancient sources like Suetonius paint a vivid and unflattering picture of this period. They describe Nero's wifely duties in a way that is designed to shock and outrage their readers. They talk about him wearing the saffron-coloured veil of a bride, about him submitting to Doryphorus in a way that was seen as humiliating for a Roman man, let alone an emperor. They describe him as being obsessed with his wifely persona, as if he were a method actor who had completely lost himself in the role. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is the fact that Roman men, especially those who were considered effeminate, were often caricatured in graffiti and popular art. Historians still argue whether any of this art was directly inspired by Nero's behaviour, but it's a fascinating thought. Could there have been satirical drawings of Nero in a stola, being led around by Doryphorus scrawled on the walls of Roman taverns? It's a tantalising idea, a glimpse into the popular reaction to Nero's bizarre behaviour. We know that the Roman people, at least at first, were more forgiving of Nero than the elite, but even they must have been shocked by this. Historians still argue whether Nero's performance of these gender roles was a genuine expression of his own identity, or if it was a political act designed to further humiliate and undermine the Roman elite. Was he a man who genuinely felt trapped in the body of a man, or was he a master manipulator using gender as a weapon? The sources, as always, are biased. They see him as a monster, a man who had completely lost his mind. But what if we were to look at it from a different perspective? What if we were to see him as an artist, a performance artist on the grandest stage in the world? What if we were to see him as a man who was so bored with the traditional role of a Roman emperor that he decided to invent a new one for himself? And what about Doryphorus? He was now in an even more impossible position than before. He was the husband of the most powerful man in the world. He was the one who was now expected to act like a Roman patriarch, with all the power and authority that came with the title. He was a freedman who now had a direct line to the emperor's ear, a man who could get things done, and a man who was feared and resented in equal measure. He would have had to walk a very fine line. He would have had to be careful not to overstep his bounds, not to appear too powerful, not to draw too much attention to himself. He was, in a sense, a prisoner of his own success. He had risen to the very top, but he was now completely dependent on the whims of a man who was becoming more and more unpredictable by the day. The palace, the Domus Aurea, Nero's great golden house, became the stage for this bizarre theatrical performance. It was a place of opulence and excess, a place where the rules of Rome no longer applied. You can almost see Nero now, sitting in a room with walls of shimmering gold, talking to his husband about the day's household duties. You can almost hear the nervous whispers of the servants, the forced laughter of the courtiers, and the quiet, simmering resentment of the senators who had to watch this grotesque charade every single day. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a crisis. It was a sign that the emperor's mind was not on the affairs of the state, but on the affairs of his own bizarre theatrical life. It was a sign that Rome was no longer being ruled by a man who respected its traditions, but by a man who saw them as a plaything, something to be twisted and subverted for his own amusement. And for the Roman elite, this was more frightening than any political intrigue or military defeat. This was a sign that the very foundation of their world was crumbling, and that there was nothing they could do to stop it. The emperor had become a wife, the freedman had become a husband, and the Roman world was holding its breath, waiting for the next act of the play to begin. And as we will soon see, the next act would involve not just gender role reversals, but a complete blurring of the lines between the personal and the political, with consequences that would be felt for centuries to come. With Nero now fully immersed in his wifely role, the imperial palace becomes less a seat of government and more a grand theatre. You're no longer just an observer. You feel like part of the audience, watching a play where the emperor is the lead actress and Doryphorus is his co-star. Every day is a new act, a new performance designed to shock and awe. The palace itself, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, is the perfect backdrop for this grand spectacle. Its walls were reportedly covered in gold, ivory and mother of pearl, and its ceilings were painted with murals depicting scenes from Greek mythology. This was not a place of quiet contemplation, it was a place of sensory overload, a stage for Nero's endless theatrical displays. A mainstream historical fact is that the Domus Aurea was one of the most extravagant palaces ever built in Rome. It covered a massive area, encompassing not just a series of buildings, but also landscaped gardens, vineyards, and even an artificial lake. The central dining room, according to Suetonius, had an ivory ceiling with panels that could be turned to shower the guests with flowers and perfume. The dome of this room would also revolve, mimicking the motion of the heavens. It was a palace designed for a god, or at least for a man who believed he was one. In this palace, Nero and Doryphorus played out their bizarre roles. They weren't just a couple, they were a performance. Nero, in his stola and veil, would often host lavish banquets where he would play the part of the demure wife, while Doryphorus would play the part of the stern, Roman husband. You can imagine the scene. Nero, with a forced blush, accepting gifts from his husband, while the other guests, a mix of sycophants and terrified senators, would have to pretend that everything was perfectly normal. The air would be thick with unspoken tension, the only sound being the forced laughter and the clinking of wine cups. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero was a big fan of a particular kind of Greek theatre, the pantomime, which often involved actors playing multiple roles, including female ones. This may have been a key influence on his behaviour. He was not just acting as a woman, he was performing a role that he had likely studied and admired. He was, in a sense, trying to bring the art of the theatre into his daily life, to blur the lines between reality and performance. He was a man who saw the world as his stage, and he was determined to put on the most dramatic show possible. Historians still argue whether Nero's theatrical displays were a sign of true artistic genius or simply a manifestation of his growing madness. Was he a misunderstood performance artist, or was he a deeply disturbed man who had completely lost touch with reality? We can never know for sure, but the effect was the same. His behaviour was a constant source of scandal and outrage for the Roman elite, and it was a public relations disaster for the Roman Empire. The emperor was supposed to be a symbol of stability and strength, but Nero was a symbol of chaos and subversion. Doryphorus, in all of this, was Nero's leading man. He was the one who was constantly by Nero's side, the one who was always in the spotlight. He was a freedman who now had more power and influence than most senators. He was the gatekeeper, the one who could grant or deny access to the emperor. And he was a lightning rod for the hatred and resentment of the Roman elite. They saw him not as a man, but as a symbol of Nero's madness, a living, breathing testament to the emperor's complete disregard for Roman tradition. The palace became their stage, but the entire city of Rome was their audience. Nero would often go out in public with Doryphorus by his side in a way that was designed to provoke and shock. He would dress in theatrical costumes, sing songs in the streets, and participate in chariot races and gladiatorial games. He was an emperor who was constantly seeking the spotlight, a man who loved the roar of the crowd more than the quiet counsel of his senators. He was, in a sense, a pop star before pop stars even existed. And his greatest hits were his theatrical displays with Doryphorus. He was constantly finding new ways to shock and to awe, to blur the lines between his personal life and his public duties. His relationship with Doryphorus wasn't just an affair. It was a political tool, a way for him to assert his own power and to undermine the authority of the old guard. He was a master of psychological warfare, and his palace was his weapon. But a play, no matter how grand, cannot last forever. The audience was getting restless. The senators were getting angrier. The Roman people were starting to get tired of the endless spectacles and the constant scandals. The stage lights were about to go down, and the real world, with all its messy politics and its quiet conspiracies, was about to come crashing in. The whispers were getting louder, the plots were getting more intricate, and the emperor's time on his grand stage was running out. The palace was a stage, but it was also a cage, a gilded prison from which there was no escape. And Nero, our great actor, was about to discover that the audience, and the co-star, could turn on him at any moment. As Nero's theatrical performance with Doryphorus continues to unfold, a new sound begins to permeate the halls of the palace. Whispers. They're not loud, not yet, but they're everywhere. They slither through the corridors, they hide behind the curtains, and they lurk in the shadows of the banquet halls. These whispers are the first signs of a growing conspiracy, a quiet rebellion among the Roman elite who have had enough. You, as our silent observer, can feel the palpable shift in the atmosphere. The forced laughter at the emperor's jokes is getting a little too strained, the smiles a little too tight. A mainstream historical fact is that the Roman Senate, the very body that had once declared Nero a god, was now filled with men who saw him as a lunatic. They were old men for the most part, steeped in Roman tradition and virtue. They had seen emperors come and go, but they had never seen one so openly and so completely disregard the social order. They had watched as Nero had become a wife, as he had elevated a freedman to a position of unimaginable power, and they were horrified. To them, this wasn't just a moral failing, it was a sign of madness, a clear indication that the emperor was no longer fit to rule. The conspiracy began to form in the quiet rooms of their homes, away from the prying eyes and ears of Nero's spies. It was a conspiracy born of outrage and fear. Outrage at Nero's behaviour, and fear that his madness would one day consume them all. Doryphorus, of course, was at the centre of their anger. They saw him as the corrupting influence, the man who had led the emperor down this dark path. They would whisper about his newfound wealth, about the titles Nero had bestowed upon him, and about the sheer audacity of a former slave holding so much power over the Roman Empire. A quirky, or fringe tidbit, is that some of these conspirators were not just motivated by politics, but by personal vendettas. One of Nero's senators, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, for example, was a man of great wealth and influence who had a personal grievance against the emperor. He was a popular figure in Rome, and he was able to gather a diverse group of people to his cause, from senators and knights to soldiers, and even Nero's own personal guards. It was a conspiracy that was as much about a personal score as it was about the fate of Rome. Historians still argue whether Nero was truly oblivious to these plots, or if he was simply too arrogant and self-obsessed to care. Was he a naive fool who had no idea that his enemies were gathering in the shadows, or was he a paranoid tyrant who saw enemies everywhere, even in the faces of his closest friends? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a bit of both. He was a man who was so consumed by his own theatrical performance that he couldn't see the reality that was unfolding around him. He was a man who trusted his inner circle completely, and in doing so he made himself incredibly vulnerable. The whispers began to reach Nero's ears, of course. His spies were everywhere, and they would have reported every piece of gossip, every angry word, every suspicious meeting. But Nero, in his arrogance, would have likely dismissed them as the grumbling of a few old men who were simply jealous of his genius and his happiness. He would have likely believed that his popularity with the Roman people and the loyalty of his Praetorian Guard would protect him from any real threat. He was wrong. Doryphorus, however, was likely much more aware of the danger. He had risen from a position of powerlessness to a position of immense power, and he knew how fragile that power was. He would have been constantly on guard, constantly watching for signs of betrayal. He would have been a calming presence for Nero, but also a source of paranoia. He would have likely advised Nero to be more cautious, to be more ruthless, to eliminate his enemies before they could eliminate him. And Nero, in his madness, would have likely ignored his advice, believing that his theatrical genius would protect him from all harm. This was the slow descent into madness. Nero's early reign, with its moments of brilliance and its golden age promises, was now a distant memory. The emperor had become a man who was so lost in his own world of theatre and transgression that he couldn't see the real world, the world of politics and power, that was about to come crashing down on him. The whispers were getting louder, the plots were getting more intricate, and the emperor's time on his grand stage was running out. The stage was now set for the next act, an act that would involve not just whispered conspiracies, but a catastrophic event that would change the course of Roman history forever. A fire that would consume the city of Rome, and a fire that would be forever linked with the name of Nero. The emperor's palace was a stage, but the city of Rome was about to become his personal bonfire. The quiet plotting was over, the real drama was about to begin. The stage lights are fading and the whispers have been drowned out by a new, more terrifying sound, the crackling of flames. The year is 64 AD, and a fire, one of the most famous in history, has erupted in Rome. You're no longer just an observer in the palace, you're on the streets feeling the heat, breathing in the thick, acrid smoke. This is the Great Fire of Rome, and it will forever be intertwined with the name of Nero and the madness of his court. A mainstream historical fact is that the fire began on the night of July 18th, 64 AD, in the shops around the Circus Maximus, and it burned for 6 days, consuming 10 of Rome's 14 districts. It was a catastrophic event that left tens of thousands homeless and destroyed countless homes and public buildings. The official story is that Nero was not in the city when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium. But as soon as he heard the news, he rushed back to Rome and organised a massive relief effort, opening up his own gardens and palace to the homeless and providing food and supplies. But the whispers, those quiet, insidious whispers, began to take on a new, more sinister tone. The rumour began to spread that Nero had not just been a passive observer of the fire, but that he had been the one to start it. The reason? To clear land for his extravagant new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, the very stage for his theatrical performances with Doryphorus. The rumour was amplified by a shocking and enduring image. Nero standing on a high tower, playing his lyre and singing a song about the burning of Troy as his city burned. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the idea of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is a historical inaccuracy. The fiddle, as we know it, didn't exist in ancient Rome. The instrument Nero played was the lyre, a stringed instrument similar to a small harp. The image of the fiddler is a modern invention, a way for later generations to sum up the emperor's perceived madness and indifference. But the core of the story, the image of an emperor performing while his city is consumed by flames, is a powerful and enduring one. Historians still argue whether Nero was truly responsible for the fire. Was he a pyromaniac, a man so consumed by his own artistic vision that he would burn his own city to the ground to clear a space for his palace? Or was he a scapegoat, a convenient target for a terrified populace looking for someone to blame. The ancient sources like Tacitus and Suetonius are divided on this. Tacitus, while critical of Nero, suggests that the rumours were just that, rumours. Suetonius, on the other hand, is much more willing to believe the worst of the emperor. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Nero may not have started the fire, but he certainly capitalised on it. He used the cleared land to build his extravagant new palace, and he took credit for the city's rebuilding, a move that only fueled the whispers that he had been the one to cause the destruction in the first place. And where was Doryphorus during all of this? He was right there, by Nero's side. The ancient sources don't mention him in a heroic role, dousing flames or leading relief efforts. Instead, he would have been at the centre of the emperor's world, a part of the madness. He would have seen Nero's reaction up close, would have heard the whispers and seen the fear in the eyes of the Roman people. He would have been a confidant, a sounding board, a partner in crime. His fate was now inextricably linked with the emperor's, and the fire only tightened that bond. The fire, however, had one more significant consequence for Nero. The Roman people, already suspicious of their emperor, were now outright hostile. They needed a scapegoat, and Nero, in a masterful and monstrous stroke of political cunning, provided them with one: the Christians. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero began a brutal persecution of Christians, accusing them of setting the fire. He had them sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs, crucified them, and set them on fire to light his evening garden parties. This was a turning point. It was the moment when Nero's madness crossed the line from theatrical to truly monstrous, and it was a moment that would forever define his reign as a period of cruelty and tyranny. You're watching this unfold, this descent into true evil. You're no longer just a spectator at a bizarre play, you're a witness to a monstrous crime. The fire, the whispers, the persecution of the Christians, it all adds up to a portrait of an emperor who had completely lost his mind, a man who had gone from eccentric artist to ruthless tyrant. And Doryphorus, his partner in this madness, was right there with him, sharing in the power and the terror. The golden age of debauchery was now a distant memory. The age of paranoia, cruelty and violence had begun. And the emperor, with his wife by his side, was about to double down on his theatrical displays, blurring the lines between performance and reality in a way that was even more shocking and terrifying than before. The smoke has cleared, the ashes have settled, and the city of Rome is in the process of a massive forced rebuilding. But for Nero, the Great Fire wasn't a tragedy, it was an opportunity to build his dream palace, the Domus Aurea, and an opportunity to create new public spectacles that would distract the Roman people from their suffering and his growing unpopularity. You, watching from the cheap seats, can see how the lines between Nero's private life and his public duties are now completely blurred. His personal desires have become a public show, and his palace is no longer just his home, it's the centre of the Roman world. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero was a great patron of public games and spectacles. He loved chariot racing, gladiatorial games, and theatrical performances. But unlike his predecessors, he didn't just watch, he participated. He saw himself not as an emperor but as a performer. He would sing songs on stage, race chariots in the Circus Maximus, and even act in plays. This was a direct defiance of Roman tradition, which held that a man of noble birth should not perform in public, as it was considered a profession for slaves and freedmen. Nero, in his arrogance, didn't care. He was an artist, a genius, and the rules of the old world didn't apply to him. And in all of these public spectacles, Doryphorus was right there with him. He was no longer just the emperor's wife in the private confines of the palace. He was a public figure, a man of immense influence and power. He would have been seen at Nero's side in the circus, in the theatre and in the arena. He was a constant visible reminder of the emperor's unconventional tastes and his complete disregard for Roman tradition. The Roman people, who had once been more forgiving of Nero than the elite, were now beginning to see Doryphorus as a symbol of their emperor's madness. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero's passion for music was so great that he created his own music festival, the Neronia, which was held every 5 years. The festival included poetry recitals, athletic contests and musical performances, with Nero himself as the star performer. He would reportedly compete in the musical competitions, and of course, he would always win. This was a clear example of Nero's blending of his personal passion with his public duties. He was not just an emperor, he was an entertainer, and he was determined to make the Roman Empire his personal stage. Historians still argue whether Nero's public performances were a genuine expression of his love for the arts, or if they were a calculated political move to gain popularity with the Roman people and bypass the authority of the Senate. Was he a misunderstood artist, a man ahead of his time, or was he a cynical manipulator using bread and circuses to distract the masses from his tyranny? Again, the truth is likely a mix of both. He was a man who loved the spotlight, but he was also a man who was very good at using that spotlight to his own political advantage. Doryphorus, as Nero's constant companion, was a part of this public spectacle. He was the emperor's co-star, his partner in all things. He would have been showered with gifts, titles, and public honours that were completely unprecedented for a freedman. He was a living, breathing testament to Nero's power, a man who had risen from nothing to a position of unimaginable privilege. But this position was also a precarious one. He was now a target for everyone who hated Nero, everyone who resented the emperor's madness and his disregard for Roman tradition. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with Rome, and he was a man who was walking on a very thin line. The public games and spectacles became a way for Nero to not only entertain the masses, but to also display his power and his complete control over the Roman world. He was a man who could command an entire city to come and watch him perform, and he was a man who could punish anyone who dared to criticize his art. The Senate, the old guard, the very people who had once held so much power, were now reduced to a captive audience, forced to watch as their emperor danced and sang on a stage. This was the end of the line for the old Roman virtues. The world of gravitas and pietas was a distant memory. The new world, the world of Nero, was a world of spectacle, performance, and personal desire. And in this new world, Doryphorus was not just a partner. He was an icon. He was the face of Nero's rebellion, the living embodiment of the emperor's defiance. He was a man who had been given everything, and he was a man who had everything to lose. The play was reaching its climax. The public spectacles were getting more and more extravagant, the private lives were getting more and more bizarre, and the emperor's madness was reaching its peak. But as we will soon see, the play was about to take a dark and tragic turn. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The gilded halls of the Domus area, once a stage for Nero's theatrical performances, are now becoming a gilded cage. The whispers have given way to a palpable sense of fear, a creeping paranoia that has infected the entire court. Nero's infatuation with Doryphorus, once a source of amusement and scandal, has now become a dangerous weapon. The price of his love, and of Doryphorus's influence, is about to be paid, and it will be paid in blood. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero's reign was marked by an increasing number of executions and forced suicides. As he grew more paranoid, he began to see enemies everywhere, in the Senate, in his own family, and even among his closest friends. He would accuse people of treason, of plotting against him, and he would have them eliminated with a chilling ruthlessness. The ancient sources are filled with stories of senators and noblemen being forced to take their own lives, their wealth and property confiscated by the state. This was not just a political purge, it was a reign of terror, and Doryphorus, as Nero's constant companion, was a key player in it. He was the emperor's confidant, his sounding board, his partner in all things. Nero would have confided in him, would have told him his darkest secrets and his most paranoid fears, and Doryphorus, in his position of power, would have been able to influence the emperor's decisions. He could have whispered a name in Nero's ear, could have suggested that a certain senator was a traitor, and that senator's fate would have been sealed. He was a man who had the power of life and death over the Roman elite, and he was a man who was feared and resented in equal measure. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero's favourite method of execution for his enemies was to have them poisoned. But he was reportedly so paranoid about being poisoned himself that he would have a taster try every meal before he ate it, and he would have a doctor on standby at all times. This was a man who was living in a constant state of fear, and he was projecting that fear onto everyone around him. Historians still argue whether Doryphorus was a malevolent force, an evil whisperer who encouraged Nero's cruelty, or if he was simply a survivor, a man who was doing whatever he had to do to protect himself and his position. Was he a cold-blooded manipulator, a man who used his influence to get rid of his own personal enemies? Or was he a terrified freedman who was just trying to survive in a court that was filled with madness and paranoia? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a man who had risen to the very top, and he was a man who was not going to give up his position without a fight. The price of Nero's infatuation was not just paid in blood, it was paid in trust. The Senate, the old guard, the very people who had once been Nero's most loyal supporters, were now his sworn enemies. They saw him not as an emperor, but as a monster, a man who would turn on his own people for the slightest of reasons. And they saw Doryphorus as the cause of all of it, the man who had poisoned the emperor's mind and led him down this dark path. The palace, once a stage for Nero's theatrical performances, had now become a court of horrors. Every day a new name would be whispered, a new accusation would be made, and a new life would be lost. The fear was palpable, the paranoia was contagious, and the emperor's madness was reaching its peak. And Doryphorus, as Nero's constant companion, was right there with him, sharing in the power and the terror. This was the end of the line for the golden age of debauchery. The age of paranoia, cruelty and violence had begun, and the emperor, with his wife by his side, was about to double down on his theatrical displays, blurring the lines between performance and reality in a way that was even more shocking and terrifying than before. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The relationship between Nero and Doryphorus was not just a love story. It was a power struggle, a clash of cultures, and a harbinger of the chaos to come. It was a story of a man who was so consumed by his own theatrical performance that he couldn't see the reality that was unfolding around him. It was a story of a freedman who had risen to the very top, and a story of a court that was filled with madness, paranoia, and fear. And as we will soon see, the play was about to take a dark and tragic turn, one that would end in a way that was even more shocking and heartbreaking than before. As the paranoia tightens its grip on Nero's court, you notice a strange duplication of names. It's a detail that might seem minor at first, but in a world of whispers and plots, it becomes a source of dangerous confusion. While Nero's freedman lover is Doryphorus, there is another man, a prominent rival general, who also bears the name Doryphorus. You can almost feel the collective eye roll of the historians who had to sort this out. This isn't just a quirky tidbit, it's a political headache that would have a very real impact on the lives of everyone in Nero's circle. A mainstream historical fact is that there were several prominent men named Doryphorus in ancient Rome, as it was a popular Greek name. But the most significant rival was a general, a man who had earned his place through military might and political cunning, not through the affections of an emperor. This Doryphorus was a man of the old guard, a man who believed in the Roman virtues of gravitas and virtues. He was everything Nero was not, a soldier, a leader, a man who commanded respect through his actions, not through his theatrical performances. Imagine the confusion. A senator wants to get a message to the emperor about a potential plot, and he mentions the name Doryphorus. Which Doryphorus? The freedman lover who holds the emperor's ear, or the general who commands a legion? The difference could mean the difference between a promotion and a death sentence. This was a world where a single misspoken word could lead to your ruin, and the existence of these two men with the same name was a ready-made source of intrigue and paranoia. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the confusion may have been more than just a coincidence. Some historians argue that Nero, in his madness, may have intentionally elevated his freedman lover, Doryphorus, to a position of power and prominence as a deliberate insult to the rival general. It was a way for him to say, "Look at me. I can take your name, your identity, and I can give it to a former slave, and there is nothing you can do about it." This was the kind of psychological warfare that Nero excelled at. It was a way for him to not just undermine his enemies, but to also humiliate them in the most public and personal way possible. Historians still argue whether the rival general Doryphorus was ever a real threat to Nero's power, or if he was simply a convenient name for a paranoid emperor to fear. Was he a genuine rival with a real army, or was he a phantom enemy, a creation of Nero's own terrified mind? The sources are, as always, divided. Some paint a picture of a general who was a constant source of worry for Nero, a man who had the loyalty of his troops and the respect of the Senate. Others suggest that he was just another name on a long list of people Nero believed were plotting against him. But regardless of the general's real power, the existence of these two Doryphoruses had a very real impact on the court. Nero's Doryphorus, the freedman lover, was now a lightning rod for the anger and resentment of the old guard. They saw him not just as a symbol of Nero's madness, but also as a symbol of the emperor's disrespect for the military, for the very men who had built the Roman Empire. They saw him as an upstart, a man who had not earned his place, a man who was an insult to the memory of their ancestors. The general, Doryphorus, on the other hand, was now a symbol of hope for the old guard. He was a man who represented the old Roman virtues, a man who they believed could one day save Rome from the madness of Nero. They would have whispered his name in the shadows, would have hoped that he would one day march on Rome and restore order. He was a phantom threat, a name that struck fear into the heart of Nero and hope into the hearts of his enemies. The palace, once a stage for Nero's theatrical performances, had now become a court of intrigue, a place where a single name could mean the difference between life and death. The emperor, with his wife by his side, was now living in a world of his own making, a world where the lines between reality and paranoia were completely blurred, and Doryphorus, the freedman, was at the centre of it all, a man who was both a symbol of Nero's power and a target for his enemies. This was the quiet before the storm. The whispers were getting louder, the plots were getting more intricate, and the emperor's time on his grand stage was running out. But before the final act could begin, before the empire could come crashing down, there would be a tragic and sudden end to the life of Nero's beloved wife, an event that would send the emperor into a tailspin of grief and madness that would change the course of his reign forever. The whispers have stopped. The confusion over the two Doryphoruses has been rendered moot by a tragic final silence. You're watching from a distance as a hush falls over Nero's palace, a hush that is more terrifying than any scream. The man who had been the emperor's lover, his confidant, his wife, is dead. The ancient sources are vague on the cause, but they are unanimous on the effect. Nero was devastated. This wasn't a political death, a murder, or an assassination. It was a sudden, tragic loss that sent the emperor into a tailspin of grief that would change the course of his reign forever. A mainstream historical fact is that the ancient sources do not give a clear reason for Doryphorus's death. Some suggest he died of a sudden illness. Others hint at a possible accident. A few with a note of malice even suggest that Nero, in a fit of rage, may have been the cause. The truth is lost to time, but the outcome is not. Doryphorus, the man who had risen from slavery to the inner circle of the emperor, was gone. Imagine Nero's reaction. This was not a man who was used to loss. He was a man who believed he could control everything, even life and death itself. He had commanded legions. He had signed death warrants. He had presided over the fates of millions. But he could not command Doryphorus to live. He could not bring him back from the dead. This was a direct personal challenge to his divine power, and he was completely unprepared for it. The grief for Nero was not a quiet, private affair. It was a public spectacle, a theatrical performance on the grandest stage of all, his own life. The ancient sources tell of him wailing and tearing his hair, of him refusing to eat or sleep, of him speaking to Doryphorus's ghost in the quiet of the night. He was a man who was so consumed by his own grief that he couldn't see the reality that was unfolding around him. The play was over, the co-star was gone, and the lead actor was left alone on a dark and empty stage. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero's grief was so profound that he reportedly had a funeral pyre built for Doryphorus that was as grand as that of a Roman emperor. The funeral rites, which were usually reserved for the most important members of the Roman elite, were performed for a freedman. This was a final, theatrical act of defiance, a way for Nero to not only mourn his loss, but to also show the Roman world that Doryphorus was in his eyes an equal to any emperor. Historians still argue whether Nero's grief was genuine, or if it was another one of his theatrical performances. Was he a man who was truly heartbroken by the loss of his lover, or was he a master manipulator who was using his grief to gain sympathy and to distract from his own growing unpopularity? The sources, as always, are biased. They paint a picture of a man who was either a monster or a madman, but never a man who was capable of genuine human emotion. But as you watch from the shadows, you can see the truth. He was a man who was both. He was a man who was capable of great cruelty, but he was also a man who was capable of great love. And in that moment, in the wake of Doryphorus's death, that love was all that mattered. The court, which had been so consumed by whispers and plots, was now in a state of stunned silence. The senators, the courtiers, the very people who had so hated Doryphorus and had so resented his power, were now forced to watch as their emperor grieved. They would have been a mixture of relieved and terrified. Relieved that the freedman who had held so much power was gone, but terrified of what a grieving, unpredictable Nero would do next. The death of Doryphorus was a turning point. It was the moment when Nero's madness crossed the line from theatrical to truly monstrous. He was a man who had lost the one person who had understood him, the one person who had been his confidant, his partner in all things, and now he was alone. The play was over, the curtain had fallen, and the emperor was left alone on a dark and empty stage. And as we will soon see, he was not a man who was capable of being alone for very long. His grief would soon give way to a new obsession, a new theatrical performance, one that would be even more shocking and more bizarre than the one that had come before. The emperor was about to find a new wife, and he was about to create a new reality for himself, one that was even more terrifying than the one he had just lost. The silence in the palace is heavy, thick with the weight of Nero's grief, but as you know, our theatrical emperor is not one to sit in a quiet, dark room for very long. The stage is empty, the leading role is vacant, and he is a man who cannot stand to be alone in the spotlight. His grief, that raw, unadulterated pain, begins to curdle and twist into something else, a new obsession. He's not looking for a new lover, he's looking for a replacement, a living, breathing memorial to the man he just lost, and he finds him in a young man named Sporus. A mainstream historical fact is that Sporus was a young man of striking resemblance to Doryphorus, a beautiful youth who caught Nero's eye in the wake of his grief. The ancient sources, like Suetonius, are very clear on this point. They describe Sporus as a boy who looked so much like Doryphorus that Nero, in his madness, believed he could be a physical substitute for his lost love. This wasn't a new relationship. It was a desperate theatrical attempt to bring the past back to life. Imagine Sporus's position. He was a young man who suddenly found himself as the object of a grieving emperor's affection. He was not a lover, he was a prop. He was a living memorial, a walking, talking tribute to a man who was no longer there. He was a man who was loved not for who he was, but for who he resembled. He was a prisoner of his own face, and he was about to be a prisoner of Nero's madness. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero's obsession with Sporus was so profound that he would often refer to him as Doryphorus, as if he were trying to force the past into the present. He would shower him with the same gifts, the same titles, the same public honours that he had given to his lost lover. It was a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to pretend that nothing had changed, that the world was still the same, and that the man he loved was still alive. Historians still argue whether Sporus was a willing participant in Nero's madness, or if he was a terrified victim who had no choice but to play along. Was he a man who was so seduced by the power and the privilege that came with being the emperor's favourite that he was willing to do anything to keep it? Or was he a young man who was so terrified of the emperor's wrath that he had no choice but to play the part he had been given? The sources, as always, are biased. They paint a picture of a man who was a willing accomplice to the emperor's madness, but the truth is likely far more complex. He was a man who was trapped in a gilded cage, and he was a man who had no way out. The palace, once a stage for Nero's theatrical performances, was now a place of grief, a place of memory, a place of madness. The emperor was not just a grieving widower, he was a man who was desperately trying to rewrite history, to bring back the past, to make the world make sense again. And in Sporus, he believed he had found the key. This was the end of the line for the golden age of debauchery. The age of grief, paranoia, and violence had begun, and the emperor, with his new wife by his side, was about to double down on his theatrical displays, blurring the lines between performance and reality in a way that was even more shocking and terrifying than before. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The play was reaching its climax. The public spectacles were getting more and more extravagant, the private lives were getting more and more bizarre, and the emperor's madness was reaching its peak. But as we will soon see, the play was about to take a dark and tragic turn. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the Emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. Nero's grief for Doryphorus has curdled into a dark theatrical obsession with the young Sporus. But as you watch from the shadows, you realise this isn't just a simple case of a new love replacing an old one. This is a descent into a new kind of madness, a level of depravity that would shock even the jaded Roman elite. Nero's obsession with Sporus is not about affection. It is about a monstrous desire to physically recreate the man he lost. He is not just looking for a replacement. He is trying to make a perfect copy, and he is willing to commit a shocking act to do it. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero, in his madness, ordered Sporus to be castrated. This was not a punishment. It was a bizarre act of devotion, a grotesque attempt to make Sporus a physical replica of his lost wife, Doryphorus. The ancient sources are explicit on this point, and their descriptions are filled with a chilling mixture of horror and fascination. This was a deliberate act of violence, a complete and total violation of Sporus's humanity, all in the name of Nero's twisted grief. Imagine the scene. A young man, beautiful and innocent, is brought before the emperor. He is told that he will be given a new life, a new identity, a new role. But this new role comes with a price that is paid in blood and in pain. The castration of Sporus was not just a physical act, it was a symbolic one. It was a way for Nero to completely possess Sporus, to make him his own, to strip him of his masculinity, and to turn him into a living, breathing memorial to his lost love. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Roman society had a complex and often contradictory view of eunuchs. While they were seen as a sign of decadence and foreign influence, they were also often trusted with positions of great power and influence, especially in the imperial court. They were seen as being loyal and trustworthy, as they had no family to plot on behalf of. Nero, in his madness, may have seen this as a way to not only recreate Doryphorus, but to also create a companion who was completely and totally loyal to him, a companion who would never betray him. Historians still argue whether Nero's actions were a manifestation of his own gender identity issues, or if they were a purely political act designed to further humiliate and undermine the Roman elite. Was he a man who genuinely felt trapped in the body of a man and was projecting that feeling onto Sporus? Or was he a master manipulator using gender as a weapon, a man who was so bored with the traditional role of a Roman emperor that he decided to invent a new one for himself? The sources, as always, are biased. They paint a picture of a man who was a monster, a man who had completely lost his mind. But what if we were to look at it from a different perspective? What if we were to see him as an artist, a performance artist on the grandest stage in the world? What if we were to see him as a man who was so obsessed with his own theatrical performance that he was willing to do anything to keep it going? The palace, once a stage for Nero's theatrical performances, had now become a place of horror. The emperor was not just a grieving widower. He was a man who was desperately trying to rewrite history, to bring back the past, to make the world make sense again. And in Sporus, he believed he had found the key. He had a living, breathing memorial to his lost love, a man who was now physically and emotionally his, a man who was completely and totally dependent on him. This was the end of the line for the golden age of debauchery. The age of grief, paranoia and violence had begun, and the emperor, with his new wife by his side, was about to double down on his theatrical displays, blurring the lines between performance and reality in a way that was even more shocking and terrifying than before. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The play was reaching its climax. The public spectacles were getting more and more extravagant, the private lives were getting more and more bizarre, and the emperor's madness was reaching its peak. But as we will soon see, the play was about to take a dark and tragic turn. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The castration of Sporus was not the end of Nero's bizarre theatrical performance, it was just the beginning of the next act. With Sporus physically altered to resemble his lost love, Nero's grief gave way to a renewed and even more unsettling obsession. He wasn't just parading a look-alike, he was once again going to marry, and once again he was going to take on the role of the wife. You're watching a level of psychological self-destruction that is truly breathtaking. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero held a public marriage ceremony, this time with Sporus as the wife. The ancient sources are explicit, almost gleeful in their descriptions of this grotesque spectacle. He dressed Sporus in the full regalia of a Roman bride, with the saffron veil and the stola. He gave him a dowry and had him carried over the threshold of the imperial palace just as a Roman bride would be. The ceremony was a macabre reenactment of his earlier marriage to Doryphorus, but this time the performance was even more elaborate, even more defiant, even more shocking. Imagine the scene. The Roman Senate, the very men who had been plotting against Nero in the shadows, were now forced to attend this public spectacle. They would have watched, their faces a mask of forced smiles and barely concealed disgust, as their emperor once again subverted every social and religious norm that had held Rome together for centuries. This wasn't just a political statement, it was a personal one. It was a way for Nero to not only assert his power, but to also rub his enemies' faces in his own bizarre theatrical grief. He was a man who was so consumed by his own performance that he couldn't see the reality that was unfolding around him. He was a man who had gone from a grieving widower to a desperate theatrical bride, and he was taking the entire Roman Empire down with him. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero was so devoted to the illusion that he would often refer to Sporus as his wife, and even his empress. He would reportedly have Sporus by his side during official functions, and he would often give him gifts and honours that were usually reserved for the empress. He was a man who was desperately trying to force the world to accept his new reality, a reality that was completely and totally of his own making. Historians still argue whether Nero's marriage to Sporus was a sign of his growing madness, or a calculated political move to further humiliate and undermine the Roman elite. Was he a man who was truly in love with Sporus, and was just trying to find a way to express that love in a world that was not ready for it? Or was he a cynical manipulator using love as a weapon, a man who was so bored with the traditional role of a Roman emperor that he decided to invent a new one for himself? The sources, as always, are biased. They paint a picture of a man who was a monster, a man who had completely lost his mind. But what if we were to look at it from a different perspective? What if we were to see him as an artist, a performance artist on the grandest stage in the world? What if we were to see him as a man who was so obsessed with his own theatrical performance that he was willing to do anything to keep it going? The palace, once a stage for Nero's theatrical performances, had now become a place of horror. The emperor was not just a grieving widower, he was a man who was desperately trying to rewrite history, to bring back the past, to make the world make sense again. And in Sporus, he believed he had found the key. He had a living, breathing memorial to his lost love, a man who was now physically and emotionally his, a man who was completely and totally dependent on him. This was the end of the line for the golden age of debauchery. The age of grief, paranoia, and violence had begun, and the emperor with his new wife by his side was about to double down on his theatrical displays, blurring the lines between performance and reality in a way that was even more shocking and terrifying than before. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The play was reaching its climax. The public spectacles were getting more and more extravagant, the private lives were getting more and more bizarre, and the emperor's madness was reaching its peak. But as we will soon see, the play was about to take a dark and tragic turn. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. Nero's bizarre marriage to Sporus, his public performances, and his increasingly erratic behaviour are no longer just a source of scandal for the Roman elite. The whispers and plots, which had been simmering for years, are now boiling over. The empire, a vast and complex machine, is beginning to crack under the pressure of its mad emperor. You're no longer just a spectator. You're feeling the ground tremble beneath your feet as the world you know begins to come undone. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero's reign was not just a series of personal scandals, it was a period of severe political and economic mismanagement. His extravagant spending, his endless public games and spectacles, and his massive building projects like the Domus Aurea had drained the imperial treasury. He was forced to devalue the currency, which led to inflation and economic instability. The Roman people, who had once been so forgiving of his eccentricities, were now suffering from the consequences of his rule. The golden age of debauchery was now a distant, bitter memory. The Senate, which had been reduced to a captive audience for Nero's theatrical performances, was now actively plotting against him. They saw him not as an emperor, but as a tyrant, a man who had completely lost his mind and was dragging the Roman Empire down with him. The conspiracies, which had once been quiet and desperate, were now open and audacious. The old guard, the men who had once believed in the Roman virtues of gravitas and pietas, were now willing to do anything to get rid of the man who had so publicly mocked their traditions and their beliefs. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero's paranoia was so great that he began to have his own personal guards, the Praetorian Guard, arrested and executed on the flimsiest of pretexts. He saw betrayal everywhere, even among the men who were sworn to protect him. This was a critical mistake. The loyalty of the Praetorian Guard was the key to an emperor's power, and Nero, in his madness, was systematically destroying it. He was a man who had no one left to trust, a man who was completely and totally alone in his gilded cage. Historians still argue whether Nero's political mismanagement was a result of his madness, or if it was a deliberate strategy to consolidate power and dismantle the old guard. Was he a naive fool who had no idea how to run an empire? Or was he a cynical manipulator who was using economic instability and political purges to get rid of his enemies and assert his own new, modern vision for Rome? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a man who was so consumed by his own theatrical performance that he couldn't see the reality that was unfolding around him. He was a man who was so confident in his own genius that he believed he could ignore the laws of economics and the traditions of the Roman state. The empire, which had been so strong and so stable for so long, was now on the brink of collapse. The provinces, which had been paying taxes to Rome for centuries, were now in revolt. The legions, which had been loyal to the emperor for generations, were now marching on Rome. The whispers had become a roar, and the emperor's time on his grand stage was running out. Sporus, Nero's wife, was at the centre of this chaos. He was a man who was not just a symbol of Nero's madness, but also a symbol of the emperor's tyranny. He was a man who was reviled by the Roman elite, a man who was seen as the cause of all of Rome's problems. He was a man who was walking on a very thin line, a man who was completely and totally dependent on the whims of a madman. And as we will soon see, that dependency would be his downfall. The play was reaching its climax. The public spectacles were getting more and more extravagant, the private lives were getting more and more bizarre, and the emperor's madness was reaching its peak. But as we will soon see, the play was about to take a dark and tragic turn. The price of this infatuation, the price of this performance, was about to be paid, and it would be paid in blood. The golden stage was about to become a blood-soaked arena, and the emperor's new leading man was about to discover that the spotlight could be a very dangerous place to stand. The Roman world was holding its breath, waiting for the final act to begin. The emperor was a man who had gone from a grieving widower to a desperate theatrical bride, and he was taking the entire Roman Empire down with him. The stage was set for a confrontation, a battle for the soul of Rome, and the winner would be the man who was able to seize power from the hands of the mad emperor. The final curtain was about to fall, and the emperor's final act was about to begin. The world was watching, and the world was about to be changed forever. The world has come crashing down. The whispers are now a deafening roar, the plots have become an open revolt, and the legions are marching on Rome. The emperor, our theatrical hero, has been abandoned. His Praetorian Guard, his most loyal protectors, have turned on him. His Senate has declared him a public enemy. His life, once a grand performance on the world's greatest stage, is now a frantic fight for survival. A mainstream historical fact is that Nero, abandoned by his court and his guards, fled Rome in a state of utter desperation. He was a man who had never known hardship, a man who had been raised in a world of unimaginable luxury. He was a man who was now on the run, with only a few loyal freedmen by his side. The ancient sources paint a tragic and almost pathetic picture of his final moments. He was a man who was so terrified of being captured and publicly executed that he begged his loyal freedmen to help him take his own life. Imagine the scene. A man who had once ruled the known world, a man who had once been a god, is now hiding in a small villa outside of Rome, with the sound of the approaching horsemen growing louder and louder. He is a man who is so consumed by his own fear that he cannot even bring himself to do the deed. He tries to stab himself, but his hand shakes. He asks his freedmen to do it for him, but they refuse. This was the final tragic act of a man who had spent his entire life performing for an audience, but in the end, he was left with no one to watch him, no one to applaud him, and no one to help him. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this time is that Nero's final words were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me." This was a final theatrical flourish, a last act of defiance from a man who saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a misunderstood genius. It was a final, desperate attempt to control his own narrative, to make the world remember him not as a monster, but as a great artist who had been betrayed by his own people. Historians still argue whether Nero's final act was a sign of his complete and total madness, or if it was a moment of clarity, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his own story. Was he a man who was so lost in his own theatrical performance that he couldn't see the reality that was unfolding around him? Or was he a man who, in his final moments, was finally able to see himself for what he was? A man who had been a god, a man who had been an emperor, a man who had been an artist, and a man who had been a complete and total failure. The downfall of Nero was not just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. It was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the dynasty that had been founded by Augustus himself. It was the end of a period of stability and peace, and the beginning of a period of civil war and chaos. The Roman Empire, which had been so strong and so stable for so long, was now on the brink of collapse, and the world was about to be changed forever. And what about Sporus? Nero's wife was captured and brought before the new emperor Otho. Otho reportedly saw in Sporus a resemblance to his own wife, Poppaea, and he took him into his service. But Sporus' story, like so many others from this time, has a tragic end. He was eventually brought before the next emperor, Vitellius, who planned to have him play the role of a woman in a public performance, a final, grotesque act of humiliation. Sporus, in a final act of defiance, took his own life. He was a man who had been a prisoner of his own face, a man who had been a prop in someone else's play, and he was a man who was finally able to reclaim his own dignity. The legacy of Nero is a complicated one. He's remembered as a tyrant, a madman, a man who fiddled while Rome burned, but he is also remembered as an artist, a visionary, a man who dared to defy the social and religious norms of his time. He was a man who was both a monster and a genius, a man who was both loved and hated, and a man who will forever be a source of fascination and debate. His reign, with its bizarre theatrical performances, its public spectacles, its tragic love stories, and its final, pathetic end, is a story that will continue to be told for centuries to come. The lights dim now. The long journey through Nero's palace and the tangled web of his reign comes to an end. It's hard to believe that such a whirlwind of power, perversion, and paranoia could ever have been real, isn't it? But it was. So as the final echoes of the lyre and the distant shouts of the Roman mob fade into the background, remember how fragile power can be, and how easily a man's obsession can unravel an entire empire. The ancient city is now silent, but the ghosts of its past still whisper their stories. Take a deep breath. The night is quiet again, and all that's left is the gentle hum of your fan and the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath. Let the dust settle on this strange and tragic tale. It's time to rest.